Good morning. Welcome to another icy Friday. We're going to approach in an extraordinary way, both with the panel today, with the images you'll see, but also with the way this all came about. It's quite interesting, but you'll hear that story in a moment. Before Provost Dr. Mark Sargent introduces the panel and the choreography of the time today, let me open us in prayer. Will you stand with me, please? That's the reason you have pews, right? Let's pray. Father, it's been an extraordinary month of seeing our culture and our political system work, of celebrating both an inauguration and the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. We look forward to another month of celebrating presidents who were pivotal to our history. And while we never equate our kingdom with your kingdom, we do praise you for men and women of courage who have helped build this country and the freedoms that it offers. Help us never to take it for granted. We thank you for the opportunity to come together, to reflect together on just a piece of that history and the way it's intersected with our life here at Gordon. Open our ears. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. Last week, I'm sure many of you watched the inauguration of President Barack Obama. The event, as you knew, drew unprecedented crowds to Washington, D.C. The inauguration also seemed to end what often seemed an endless presidential campaign that extended for more than 2 years. This morning, we're going to invite you to jump back with us 144 years to a different inauguration and a different campaign. In just a couple of weeks, we will be commemorating the bicentennial of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. President Obama, as you know, has patterned much of his inaugural activities on Lincoln's heritage, even taking the oath of office on Lincoln's Bible. To talk with us about Lincoln this morning, I'm joined by three Gordon professors. On my immediate right is Professor Dave Goss, who is in our history department and directs Gordon's and has many fans in Gordon's Institute for Public History. Walter, who is a history professor and an intellectual historian. And finally, on my far right is Dr. Cliff Hersey, who is the Dean of our Global Education Program, archivist at the Second Church in Dorchester, which is important to our story this morning. In fact, thank you. Special story to tell us as we get started about a discovery they made this fall while they were doing some cleanup and archival work for the Second Church in Dorchester. The church, built in 1806, provides housing and classroom space for students in our Gordon in Boston program. And Dr. Hersey actually, as I mentioned, volunteers his time there as an assistant archivist. So, David and Cliff, tell us what you found.
Well, the instance that we're referring to involved the cleaning up of a large room that was filled with a great deal of historical memorabilia. And amongst all of the boxes and various piles of books and papers, we found a cardboard box, a simple brown cardboard box that was unidentified. And like so many other things, we had to look inside and find out what was there. Upon opening this box, we found a pile of unbleached linen. We really weren't clear at all what it was. We had to remove them. We took them out. We spread them out on the floor. And it was only at that time that we discovered that what we had found was a box containing campaign banners, two of them from the 1864 presidential campaign of Abraham Lincoln, who at that time, of course, was running against General George B. McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate, and another campaign banner, which we were equally surprised to discover, of the Grant 1868 Grant campaign. So we immediately recognized these two objects not only were extremely rare, but what added to the value was that inside each of these banners was a handwritten note that had been sewn in, giving a background as to when they had been made, how they had been displayed, what their purposes had been. And when we realized that we had the provenance as well as the objects and that they were exceedingly rare, we brought it to the attention of the school.
Thanks, David. It might be helpful for everyone if we had a little background on the history of the Second Church. Cliff, perhaps you can say a word about the history of the Second Church. Yeah.
Sure, just very briefly. We have to think about Dorchester as a very different place from what it is now. Most of you think of Dorchester as a very compact and a place where lots and lots of people live. In its early ages, it was a lot like Wenham, lots of farms and so on. And the Second Church was built in 1806 as an extension of the First Church, which had been there for already 175 years. It was not established over some theological difficulty, but rather simply as an extension of the congregation that had been there for so many years. And but it almost immediately after Dr. John Codman became its first pastor was plunged into some controversy because this was the era, as you might know, when we were having a debate in this country theologically over the difference between Trinitarian and Unitarian thought. It wasn't actually, the titles weren't put on it at that point, but this was a very contentious debate, and most of Boston was going to the Unitarian side. And Dr. John Codman was one of the few pastors in the Boston area who held on to his rather conservative at that time Trinitarian thought, and there was a great debate after he took the office of the pastor there over this particular issue. He was almost thrown out of his pulpit, managed to survive and have a very long pastorate there at the Second Church. But the Second Church is literally the second church in Dorchester, a second parish, and has a long history of service to the community.
At this time, we'd like to show you the banner that they found. We have some students, history students, who are going to come up and hold up the banner for you, which they found in the Second Church. So why don't you come at this time?
I want to mention Miriam.
Yeah, why don't you? Miriam. Go ahead.
While we're getting ready to see the banners, I'd just like to recognize this lady here in the middle on the Lincoln and Hamlin banner, Mary Ellen Smiley, who is a curator at the Patton Museum in South Hamilton, and I just want to thank her for doing the work of putting these banners in shape so that we can hang them and use them, and I just want to ask you to recognize her good work with helping us with the banner.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the team. You can fold it up and bring it back, or you can stand there for another hour and a half. That would be fine. Some of you perhaps will want to see the banner up close. We're going to leave the banners on the tables behind us, and if you would like to take a closer look at it, you're welcome to come up on the platform after convocation is dismissed and see it firsthand. We would like you to have a chance to look at it. Thank you. Actually, when I first heard of David and Cliff's discovery, I must admit I thought of the long introductory chapter to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. How many have read that? A few people, good. Hawthorne once worked as a clerk in the Custom House in Salem, which overlooks the waterfront. If you haven't been there, it's a place you should go. I think you can actually see it from Mark Stevick's living room, so go to Mark's house and see the Custom House. And for those of you that have read it, you may recall that Hawthorne begins the novel with the story of a customs official who was sorting through old papers and archives and finds a cloth A among a group of papers, and goes about imagining the life of the Puritan woman who wore this A. And in one sense, that's what we're going to invite you to do today, to try to imagine with us the lives of the people who were behind the old cloth that David and Cliff discovered. A century and a half of history and legend make it difficult for us to return to that moment in 1864 when Lincoln's reelection was a cause that could have been lost. But the hands that painted the banner that you just saw were undoubtedly a little nervous. In fact, in 1864, Lincoln himself was nearly resigned to his defeat. So I'd like to ask our panelists to comment a little bit about what put him at risk. Why was Lincoln vulnerable in 1864?
Well, from a military point of view, Lincoln had been severely criticized for the way that the war had been handled. People were not at all convinced that it had been handled in the right way. And especially in 1864, there had been some very severe military reverses when everything had appeared as if Lee was on the run and that Grant was certainly going to bring the war to a successful conclusion. There were a number of Confederate victories. The Battle of the Crater was considered a serious victory. And of course, Fredericksburg, which had been besieged, was not moving ahead very well. And in fact, Lee seemed to be actually gaining some ground. So Lincoln was looking in the summer of 1864 at what he thought could be a potential and disastrous defeat, because his opponent, the peace candidate, General George B. McClellan, who he, of course, had always been severely criticized by Lincoln, was the peace candidate. And he wanted to make it very clear that he was not going to keep this war going. As soon as he was elected, he would bring the war to a conclusion through negotiation. And Lincoln felt that the nation as a whole was tired of war. They were tired of bloodshed. And that McClellan would certainly win. The most famous quote comes to us from Lincoln himself, and he confides to his personal aide. He says, "I'm going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, I'm going to be beaten badly."
The only thing to add to that is that obviously the war was a tragedy. There's a large section of Northern opinion that would have favored something like what McClellan wanted. And the real issue is, what about emancipation? What about slavery? And the temptation, at least in a significant section of Northern opinion, was to abandon emancipation. The quick timeline is, this is 1864. For a year and a half, the Emancipation Proclamation had been in effect. Emancipation had been in effect, but it was not irreversible. Lincoln feared that that McClellan and a large section of Northern opinion would favor selling out on emancipation, turning back, putting these freed slaves back into slavery in order to do a deal with the South, basically, to call off the war by abandoning emancipation. So that was a tough issue to face.
It seems that after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, which were two victories very close to each other in 1863, there was a strong sense that the war, you could possibly see an end to the war. And a lot of the debate began to be focused on the terms of the Reconstruction or the terms of peace. And at that time, it seemed that Lincoln was particularly vulnerable to criticisms from many within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, he had a more difficult time securing the loyalties of those within the Republican Party leading up to the nomination than he actually did in the general election. What caused the doubt? For instance, the Massachusetts contingent of legislators were not really big Lincoln fans. The governor of Massachusetts, Andrew, at that time, thought his nomination was a folly. Charles Sumner senator was a fervent critic. What made Lincoln vulnerable with his own party? Yeah.
Lincoln saw, you have to have a policy about what to do with the South after the war is over, after it's concluded. They call this the Reconstruction policy. Lincoln's envisioned at first, when the war has not been won, And he wants to, the North has got these victories, and yet still the war it's a tragedy. People want it to be ended as quickly as possible. Lincoln saw a soft reconstruction, that is, soft toward the white South power structure, as a way to help end the war fairly quickly. This would not be so much an issue of emancipation. He hoped to keep emancipation, and yet he hoped to. He said we can go easy on civil rights, basically civil rights for freed slaves after the war, and not hold the Southern whites their feet to the fire too much on that kind of issue. Let the Southern whites do what they want, and if we go and with that kind of a policy, Lincoln thought, then they will cry uncle earlier. The South will give in and stop the war earlier if he announces this soft policy. And that was very alienating and seemed like a terrible compromise to the Massachusetts Republicans, who wanted more real civil rights in the South after the war.
Yeah, and one of the other, I think, points that is oftentimes forgotten is that although the Emancipation Proclamation had actually been declared following the Battle of Antietam, in actuality, it only freed those slaves that were in the South, in the states that were then in rebellion. In other words, states that had the institution of slavery but had remained loyal to the Union still had slaves. They still possessed slaves. It represented a large amount of wealth that were contained in places like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. And when the war would be over, the big question was, well, what happens to all of that personal property amongst these individuals who remained loyal to the Union and yet were going to lose their slaves?
Right. And it was that loyalty to, or gentleness toward the border states, the slaveholding states that had become, or were loyal to the Union or were beginning to militarily be overrun, that Lincoln's softness or gentleness towards them is what alienated, I think, the radical Republicans who wanted abolition to be pushed as a result of the Union victory. And Lincoln, the debate, I suppose, is whether or not he put the emphasis so much on saving the Union that he didn't care about slavery, or whether or not he thought that saving the Union would be the best way to eliminate slavery. Is that inevitably, if the Union were preserved, the momentum of history was against the expansion of slavery. So if he could save the country, he would ultimately politically be more pragmatic in achieving the end of slavery.
This Horace Greeley letter.
Yeah.
Let me put just a human face on this. I don't claim to be the historian that these fellows are, but I have looked at these archives and have done a little bit of searching. Of the 2,600 adult males who were eligible to vote in 1864, over 1,300 of them were in the war. This was a town, like many, many towns in America, where no one was untouched by the war. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, makes a statement early on in the book that a contemporary war today, to rival the Civil War, would have to put 6 million people on the field. And that's the kind of way in which the war touched literally every family. And I think people were, by 1864, simply sick of war, sick of losses, and sick of all of the things that they were having to experience. I hope that helps.
We've already mentioned the McClellan campaign against Lincoln, and once he won his party's nomination, Lincoln squared off against his former general McClellan. I'm interested in your thoughts about what distinguished their campaigns, and just how would history have been a little bit different had Lincoln lost that 1864 election?
Yes.
Well, clearly one of the most crucial issues, and I think that's one of the reasons why the 1864 election was so pivotal, is that McClellan, when he first announced that he would accept the candidacy, also made it clear that he says, and I'm quoting him in a public speech, "If I am elected, I will recommend an immediate armistice and a call for a convention of all states, including the southern states, and insist upon exhausting all and every means to secure peace without further bloodshed." Now, a statement like that, of course, tells the American people that this struggle, from the northern point of view, might very well have been in vain, especially if you regarded one of the principal reasons for the struggle, the freeing of slaves, and merely the preservation of the Union at all costs, basically. The South saw this statement as essentially the opportunity to take advantage of an armistice, which would bring hostilities to an immediate end, and they felt that very certainly if things went into negotiation, they would in fact get their freedom, and that the nation would be split. So that point of view is something that you have to keep in mind. Had McClellan won the election, our nation might have been incredibly different than it is today. And in point of fact, at the end of negotiations, rather than go back to war, the nation might have chosen to be divided.
Thank you, David. The church, Second Church of Dorchester, where this banner was discovered, did raise a subscription or funds to have the sign painted. And it's tempting to think that some of the supporters, if we try to imagine who they were strong abolitionists. And there's some reason for thinking this, because there were some significant anti-slavery endeavors in Dorchester and New England. And Cliff might comment a little bit about what was going on in the early 1830s leading into the Civil War era in Dorchester in the anti-slavery movement.
Actually, the Dorchester Anti-Slavery Society was formed in January of 1832. You may remember that William Lloyd Garrison, the great anti-slavery advocate, had started his Liberator magazine in 1831 and was influencing this group of people who had started this society. Very popular society, by the way, in Dorchester. That sort of culminated for the community on July 4th in 1835 when, at the Second Church in Dorchester, they held a rally, an anti-slavery rally, at which William Lloyd Garrison actually was the major speaker, and 4 pastors, including, I think, John Codman, although he isn't listed there, were part of the speakers that morning. So there was a fervent concern about anti-slavery as early as the early 1830s. We don't find evidence in John Codman's sermons or in James Means, who actually was the pastor during the Civil War era, that there was a lot of from the pulpit support for an anti-slavery movement. But many of the major people in the congregation were part of the Wide Awake Society, the Lincoln Rail Splitter Society, and all those kinds of things that were a part of the 1860 election.
Just another word on this. I think it's good to remember, and people who've been in my classes may have heard me preach this sermon before, but it's good to remember how unpopular William Lloyd Garrison and the hardcore abolitionists were as a whole in the North, not just obviously unpopular in the South, but in the North. And it's good to know that in Dorchester and other parts of Boston that they had a fair amount of support, a good amount of support. And Boston has this a proud tradition of being a city that by and large did support abolitionism, or as it was often called at that time, immediatism. Garrison started this movement, remember, as Cliff just said, 30 years prior to the Civil War, saying we should have immediate abolition of slavery. There had been anti-slavery in the U.S. before this. I mean, just in brief, in the Revolutionary era, mostly down in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Quakers. There had been the idea of colonization, which we'll come back to, that Lincoln actually advocated. Colonization basically meant, to put it in rather crude terms, back to Africa. That it would be good to have emancipation of slaves, but if you're going to do it and make it work, they said, you have to send African Americans outside of the U.S. This is not a pretty picture, but that was one of the forms of anti-slavery that existed. Garrison said no. He said we should have full civil rights and we should have immediate end to slavery starting now. And so that position was considered inflammatory, impractical. The abolitionists in many places in the North were considered as loose cannons and troublemakers, and were just pressing for an unrealistic program.
Yeah, actually I'd like to jump to there now. And Lincoln's views on slavery have certainly been the subject of considerable debate. And we want to talk about that briefly with you this morning. And as we do, we're going to flash on the screen several quotations from Lincoln on slavery, just to give you a sampling of his various views. You can certainly mark changes in his views on slavery and race, although it's difficult to forge a final judgment. So I'm interested in having our panel comment a little bit on the shades of meaning in Lincoln's understanding of slavery.
We, of course, have just mentioned, Steve has mentioned the fact that Lincoln was in favor of the idea of colonization, the Back to Africa movement. This was, of course, seen as a way of alleviating the fears of recently arrived European immigrants who were willing to work in northern factories and mills and were very much afraid that when slaves were freed and then able to seek their jobs, they would literally take away the jobs from recently arrived immigrants because they would be willing to work literally for whatever they could get. That Back to Africa movement actually sees realization in the creation of the nation of Liberia. Those of you that know African geography on the western coast of Africa, northwestern coast of Africa, Senegambia, there's a nation called Liberia, and that was established during this period of time by these people, and they colonized that nation-state by sending former slaves back to Africa. So that actually does achieve a certain amount of realization.
Lincoln wrote several things on slavery that give people the impression that he was constantly battling with what his public duty was as compared to what his private response was. If you haven't seen it already, there'll be a quotation on the screen about his letter to Horace Greeley in which he says that his paramount objective is to save the Union. And he would save it with slavery or he would save it without slavery. He would do what he could do as quickly as he could under the Constitution. But he ends by saying that it really was his own personal wish that all men would be free. And you do have this constant back and forth soul-searching on Lincoln's part, and it makes it difficult for historians to form that final judgment. And Steve, I wondered if you, could give us a thought or two about whether we can form a final judgment on Lincoln and slavery. Yeah.
One thing Provost Sargent is referring to, we had a quick conversation right before convocation began this morning about this. It's a tough issue to know exactly what Lincoln was saying in a sense, and yet every year I ask my students to write a paper telling me, was he consistent or not? Was he acting out of principle, and did he have consistent principles? Actually, I do think we can get an answer to that, but I can't give it away because other students, people out there will have to write that paper at some future point. The good thing is the guy was very clear, and he was very forthright about what he thought. Let me just read one or two quick things, and you're seeing other stuff, I believe, up on the screen. But here's one thing he said. This was in 1864, as this election season was approaching. This was in a letter he wrote, but most of his letters were made public. They were printed in newspapers, and they became public statements. He says, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think this way and feel this way. However," he says, he never thought that he had authority as president to wipe out slavery unless it was for what reason? Military necessity. Military necessity. And that's why he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And who can eliminate slavery? Who can abolish slavery? Congress. He said that's the job of Congress, but he didn't have the authority of president just to at a stroke of a pen, make that happen.
Yeah, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation as Commander-in-Chief.
Exactly.
Right, against states in rebellion.
Exactly.
And he felt that he could do that and declare slaves free in those states that were in military rebellion because he was the commander. But if it were a solidified union again, it would take an act of Congress. And there were efforts before the war was over, there were efforts to pass the famous amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, which did free the slaves. They didn't come to fruition until after the war. Mm-hmm. But on the positive side of Lincoln's concern with emancipation, there was this interesting effort to use the authority that he had to free those he could, and to lobby for legislation that would ultimately free them. The banner's campaign slogan, "The Union, it must and shall be preserved," it had become a commonplace war and campaign cry. It was widely used on Lincoln campaign banners in 1860, as well as in 1864. It's a phrase with a long history, and it has different meaning to different people. And I'm just interested in some thoughts about what's embedded in that phrase, the Union, it must and shall be preserved.
Just a quick thing on that. To us, it seems like, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's hard to get our minds around why it was so important to Lincoln and all other Union people back at the time, why the Union, that concept, became almost sacred, almost a civil religion around holding the nation together. I would just say that there was a very practical aspect to it. It was the idea that if you cannot, and Lincoln said this clearly in his first inaugural, if this government by the people cannot hold together, then our experiment has failed. People who for generations have said the U.S. has too much freedom or self-government isn't going to work in such a large, extensive territory, those naysayers and doubters would be proved right. And he also said if you let half the country essentially break away and start a new country, and you let that happen, well, what's going to happen 10, 15 years from now? What's going to happen downstream, so to speak, when another section of the country is dissatisfied or doesn't like the policy and is not able to work together and compromise, which democracies have to do? If we can't learn to do this now, then we're unleashing the forces of anarchy, and this sort of secession spirit will enter into the people. And this is not going to be the first time this happens. The United States will continue to break apart, and the world will be the loss, will be the loser for having lost the example that we are hoping that the United States at its best can provide to the world. The world will have no more big example like us to show that free popular government can work and also hold together at the same time. So union had, the stakes were very high in maintaining the union in that sense.
Yeah, actually there's some uncertainty or controversy about where the phrase comes from, because many people in New England seem to think it came from Daniel Webster, who was a senator from Massachusetts. And Webster did say a lot of things about union, but actually it comes from Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun. In 1830, they were at a banquet together, honoring the birth date of Thomas Jefferson, and Jackson gave a toast to the Union, "It must and shall be preserved." And Calhoun came back with a rebuttal toast that indicated that liberty was far more important than union. And Calhoun, as many of you know from history, Calhoun was a strong advocate of states' rights, of the secession of the states, and of the importance of Southern liberties against the appeals of union. And that's what was Daniel Webster's endeavor. Daniel Webster, the senator who tried significantly to link liberty and union together. But there was some tension between liberty and union. We think of those words, and they may sound like truisms, but liberty and union are always a little bit at odds. And you might comment a bit on some of the tensions that we saw in the 19th century.
The one thing that I think that could be, Provost Sergeant really summarized it very well already. Is everybody familiar with the idea of states' rights? If you're not, you're lucky. You haven't had to hear that in the context that we used to hear it, not just in the 1860s, but in the 1960s. It was still an issue. But it's that idea of that local control is where democracy is at, and where the local control, that is at the state level, would trump federal power. There's something to be said for that, but it can be anarchistic, it can sort of spin out of control, and unfortunately it's often been used in the service of oppressing minorities in a way. And it was brought back, not, as I was saying, not just in the 1860s, but in the 1950s and 60s in the South, that Southern states had the right to run their own institutions, keep their own way of life, and you see what I'm referring to. It was an anti-civil rights philosophy, and so often it was used in that sense. And So this struggle has a long history, really, is what we're talking about, between states' rights, liberty in that sense, local control versus federal authority.
I would only add that this whole question of states' rights is not one that just surfaces at the time of the Civil War. It's an ongoing controversy that was a very significant part of the early 19th century. And I would just point out that in 1814 we have something called the Hartford Convention right here in New England, where the New England states were so disenchanted with the federal government and with federal policies that they felt were in complete and direct conflict with the interests of New England, that the New England states threatened and came very close to seceding from the Union at that point because they felt that their rights were being violated.
Thanks. I mentioned Daniel Webster, the Massachusetts senator who was an advocate for union and tried to link liberty and union, but Webster ran into some challenges in that in 1850 because he gave a very famous speech before Congress in 1850 advocating the importance of union so much that he was willing to compromise with the South on the fugitive slave law in order to agree that the Northerners would return fugitive slaves back to southern plantations or southern states. And it was clearly an indication of a willingness at that point to put union, the preservation of the union, over the liberty of the individuals that were escaping. And it's another example of the tension in the 19th century between those two concepts. There's one other interesting irony that I think is embedded in this banner, is that below the main banner, stitched to it was another banner which had the motto, "In God We Trust." And when I first saw that, I thought, well, that's a very conventional, familiar motto that we see in all of our money. What I didn't realize was 1864, the year this banner was painted, was the first year that was adopted on U.S. coinage. It was actually adopted and put on the 2-cent coin, and the person most responsible for it was the Secretary of the Treasury, Salem Chase, who had a few issues with Lincoln, even though he was a member of Lincoln's cabinet. You might comment a little bit on the Chase-Lincoln rivalry, because I think it's an interesting backdrop. Here's a campaign banner that is advocating Lincoln with Chase's motto stuck down below. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the ironies of the whole matter of "In God We Trust" with Lincoln is the fact that Lincoln, although we think of him as certainly a godly president and a person who always had a profound sense of the leading of God in everything he did, was a very private individual when it came to matters of God. It's a very, it's certainly an important aspect of Lincoln's character that he kept his religion by and large very, very private. He, interestingly, makes very good use of the divine injunctions against what had been considered to be the cause of the Union. In his inauguration speech in 1864, he repeatedly talks about the fact that the blood that was being shed for the war that was being fought was actually payback. It was God's retribution for the sin of slavery upon the American people. And he said, hopefully the war will come to a successful conclusion and the blood will stop flowing. But if it is necessary that every drop of blood and every whip of the lash be compensated for throughout the war, then so be it. That this is the way that God will exact retribution upon a sinful nation. So Lincoln, although a very private individual, at this point in time in 1864, begins to espouse the teachings of the Bible and is a lot more overt about it.
Thank you, David. There's certainly no way that the painters of this banner could have seen what was coming in the very near future, that Lincoln would be assassinated and that Andrew Johnson would be president and that Salem Chase, who really developed that phrase, "In God We Trust," would be the Chief Justice that would be presiding at the impeachment trial of Johnson. So phrases on a banner that are entangled in some ways with the complexities of American history. Finally, as we approach Lincoln's bicentennial next month, Lincoln seems to have really seized the American imagination, in part because of the bicentennial, but also because we have elected our first African-American president. Lincoln certainly lingers in both the popular mind and in scholarly circles as someone who's representative of the idealism and the courage, but also the contradictions and some of the tragedy of American life. And as we close today, I thought just to ask if any of you have any final thoughts about what is the importance of understanding Lincoln's legacy for us today.
Let me put a human face on it again, and that is the sort of history of the Second Church in its contemporary form is one that has, in the 50s and 60s, went through a very steep decline because it was a white congregation that refused to accept the change in its neighborhood, and now is a church that hosts 3 congregations of immigrants. And it's a transition, and I think again it's in line with the movement of our society toward this ability to accept a black president and develop these kinds of opportunities for those around us in differing circumstances. So.
Yeah. I think one of the points that we haven't really arrived at as yet, although we talked about Lincoln being afraid of losing the election, I guess the obvious question is why did he win if there was so much opposition to his presidency? And I have to point out the fact that it was an overwhelming victory for him in terms of electoral votes. He received 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. Which is a pretty one-sided victory, although he only had a popular vote margin by 500,000, 500,000 people more than McClellan. What is interesting especially is McClellan was the soldiers' general. The soldiers loved McClellan, but they really disliked his affiliation with the Copperheads, with people that were perceived as being loyal, not to the Union, but to personal interest. And one soldier said, well, the reason I voted for Lincoln, he said, is because if a Democratic triumph would happen, it would be an inglorious peace, and it would be a shame upon us, and it would mean subserviency to the Southern domination. I would mean in inglorious peace and shame, I had rather stay out of here a lifetime on the front, fighting as much as I dislike it, than consent to a division of our country. We all want peace, but none want anything but an honorable peace. So the soldiers wind up voting for Lincoln as well by a great majority, and he wins the election.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your attention, but I also want to thank our panelists for being here. Let's give them a hand for... thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, for those of you that would like to come see the banner, you're welcome to walk up on the platform. Thank you very much for being here. You are dismissed.